Ilara felt the cold not as a presence, but as an absence. It was the absence of warmth, of life, of the man who had built the clapboard house that now seemed to conspire with the wind against her. The wind on the northern plains was not a simple movement of air. It was a sculptor of souls, a relentless artisan that carved away at anything soft, leaving only the hard, the stubborn, the unyielding. In the year since Liam's passing, Ilara feared she was becoming all edges and angles, a thing of rock and ice, mirroring the landscape that stretched out from her rattling window pane. The house itself argued with the wind, its timbers groaning a constant, weary complaint. Each gust found a new crack, a new seam to exploit, whispering through the walls with a chill that settled deep in her bones, a cold that no fire in the hearth could ever truly banish. It was a cold that felt like memory, like the finality of the earth they had laid over him. The land was all she had left of him. 10 acres of stubborn soil and unforgiving rock, purchased with the whole of their youthful, foolish optimism. Liam had seen potential where others saw only hardship. He had spoken of wheat fields and a sturdy barn, of a legacy written in rows of gold under a vast blue sky. But the sky was rarely blue. It was more often the color of old pewter, a heavy, oppressive lid on a world of brown and gray. The land had broken him, slowly, methodically, wearing him down with late frosts, with summer droughts, with the sheer, back-breaking labor of pulling stone after stone from the earth, as if the planet were trying to reclaim its bones. He had died not of a sudden calamity, but of a quiet erosion of spirit and strength, a slow surrender to the patient, indifferent cruelty of the place. Now the land was hers, and it felt less like an inheritance and more like a sentence. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, saw it as a liability. He was a man made of straight lines and sharp corners, a town man who measured worth in dollars and cents, and Ilara's situation made no sense to him. He came on the first Sunday of the month, his buggy kicking up dust in the summer and crunching over frost in the winter, his face always pinched with a mixture of pity and impatience. He would stand in the middle of her small kitchen, avoiding the chair with the wobbly leg, and lay out his arguments like a solicitor presenting a case. The land was worthless. The house was a tinderbox in summer and an icebox in winter. She was a woman alone, a dangerous and pitiable state in this part of the country. "Sell it, Ilara," he would urge, his voice a low, reasonable drone that grated on her nerves. "Mr. Henderson will give you a fair price for the acreage. Not much, mind you, but enough. Enough to get a small room in town, to find work as a seamstress, perhaps, to be safe, to be sensible." Each time his words felt like small, sharp stones thrown against the fragile glass of her resolve. He could not understand that leaving the land would be a second burial. It would be an admission that Liam's life, his dream, his entire existence had amounted to nothing more than a failed investment. It would be an erasure. And so she clung to the worthless land with the same fierce, irrational grip with which she clung to the memory of her husband's hand in hers. "No, Marcus," she would say, her voice quiet but unmovable. "I am staying." He would sigh, a gust of exasperation, and leave a small bag of flour or a slab of bacon on the table, charity that felt more like a judgment. The first winter alone was a lesson in the physics of survival. She learned that heat was a currency more precious than gold, and she was a pauper. She spent her days in a frantic, exhausting cycle of chopping wood, feeding the fire and huddling near its meager warmth, only to feel the cold creeping back in the moment her work ceased. The nights were the worst. She would sleep in all her layers, buried under every blanket she owned, and still wake to the sting of frost on her eyelashes. The water in the basin on the washstand was a solid block of ice by morning. She began to understand that the house was not a shelter, it was a sieve. It leaked warmth at an astonishing rate. The thin walls, the single-pane windows, the gaps in the floorboards, they were all invitations to the cold, and the cold was an impolite guest, one that never left. She felt as though she were living inside a drum, the wind a constant percussive assault on all sides. She was not living in the house. She was besieged within it. One night, during a particularly vicious storm, the wind tore a loose shutter from its hinges and slammed it against the side of the house with a crack like a rifle shot. The sound jolted her from a shallow, shivering sleep. For a terrifying moment, she thought the whole structure was coming down around her. She lay in the dark, her heart hammering against her ribs, listening to the shrieking of the wind and the groaning of the wood. It was in that moment of pure animal fear that the first seed of a different idea was planted. She was fighting a war she could not win. She was trying to hold back an ocean with a bucket. The wind, the cold, the very nature of this place. It was too powerful. You could not defeat it by building a flimsy wooden wall against it. The thought was a flicker of heresy against everything she knew, against the very image of a proper home that stood tall and proud against the elements. But what if proud was the wrong way to be? What if the answer was not to stand against the wind, but to yield to it, to hide from it? The idea lay dormant through the rest of the long, brutal winter. Survival was too immediate a concern for abstract thought. But when the spring thaw finally came, turning the frozen land into a sea of mud, the memory of that terrifying night returned. The thaw was a time of assessment. She walked the perimeter of her property, taking stock of the winter's damage. The shutter was gone, likely halfway to the next county. A section of the fence had been flattened. The roof of the small woodshed had buckled under the weight of the snow. Everywhere she looked, she saw the evidence of a battle lost. The world above ground was a place of violence and volatility. It was while clearing out the old root cellar that the flicker of an idea ignited into a steady flame. Liam had started digging it into the small, gentle rise behind the house, but like so many of his projects, it was left unfinished. It was little more than a pit, shored up with rough-hewn timbers, with a set of steep earthen steps leading down into the gloom. It was damp and smelled of soil and decay. She had gone down there to see if any of the few potatoes she had stored had survived the winter. As she descended the steps, shovel in hand, she felt the change. The wind, which had been a constant nagging presence at her back, simply vanished. The air became utterly still, and then she felt the temperature. It was cold, yes, but it was a different kind of cold. It was a deep, stable cellar cold, not the biting, aggressive cold of the air above. It was the cold of the earth itself, a constant, predictable chill that felt almost gentle by comparison. She stood at the bottom of the earthen pit, surrounded by the damp, dark soil, and held her hand up. There was no draft. She could hear the wind moaning over the opening of the cellar, a few feet above her head, a distant, powerless complaint. Down here, it could not touch her. She pressed her palm against the packed dirt of the wall. It was cool and solid. It did not rattle or groan. It did not have seams or cracks for the cold to invade. It was a single, solid thing. The earth did not fight the winter. It simply absorbed it. It held a memory of the summer's warmth deep within its belly, and it met the winter's fury with a vast, unmovable patience. An image came to her, unbidden, from a story her grandmother used to tell. It was a story from the old country, of people who lived through winters far harsher than this one. They did not build their homes on the land, her grandmother had said. They built their homes in the land. They found a hillside and dug into it, living like badgers in their sets, warm and safe while the blizzards raged over their heads. At the time, Alara had thought it a strange, primitive notion. Now, standing in the quiet, still air of the unfinished root cellar, it felt like revelation. It was the most profound, intuitive truth she had ever encountered. Everyone was doing it wrong. They built their flimsy boxes of wood and nails up into the air, into the teeth of the wind, where the full force of the winter could attack them from every side. They were fighting the sky. The answer was not in the sky, it was in the earth. Her plan formed not as a series of logical steps, but as a single, overwhelming vision. She would not repair the house, she would abandon it. She would finish what Liam had started, but on a scale he never would have imagined. She would dig. She would hollow out a space in the belly of the hill, a warren of rooms protected on all sides by the insulating mass of the earth itself. She would have a main living chamber, a small sleeping alcove, a place for a stove whose chimney would be the only part of her home truly exposed to the elements. She would have light from a single south-facing wall of windows, dug deep and protected by an overhang. She was going to build a house that the wind could not find. The work began the next day. It was a labor of staggering, almost comical proportions. She had a shovel, a pickaxe Liam had left behind, and a wheelbarrow with a wobbly wheel. Her first task was to widen and deepen the existing pit. The topsoil was soft and yielded easily, but a foot down she hit the compacted clay-like subsoil, studded with rocks ranging from the size of a fist to the size of a loaf of bread. Each shovelful was a negotiation. Each rock was an argument. The pickaxe became an extension of her arms, the shock of its impact traveling up through her wrists and into her shoulders. She would work until her muscles screamed in protest, until her hands were raw and blistered, despite the worn leather gloves she wore. She would haul the excavated earth away in the lurching wheelbarrow, dumping it to form a berm on the north side, a further shield against the prevailing winter winds. At first her neighbors paid her little mind. A widow's grief took many forms, and if Alara chose to spend her days digging a hole, it was her own sad business. But as the days turned into weeks and the pile of excavated earth grew from a mound into a small hill, curiosity turned to concern and then to ridicule. Silas, the farmer whose land bordered hers to the west, was the first to approach her directly. He was a practical man, his face a roadmap of seasons spent in the sun and wind. He had respected Liam, and he felt a kind of paternalistic pity for Alara. He found her one afternoon, covered in dirt, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat, struggling to pry a large rock from the wall of her expanding pit. He stopped his wagon at the edge of her property and watched her for a long moment, his brow furrowed. Finally he called out, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Ilara, what in God's name are you doing?" She looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. The pit was now easily 12 feet wide and 15 feet long, and she was standing waist-deep in it. "I'm building, Silas," she said, her voice raspy with effort. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "Building what? A grave? A woman's work is inside, tending a home, not outside digging one from scratch." He saw the wild, determined look in her eyes and softened his tone. "Look, I know it's been hard, but this isn't right. You'll work yourself to death before the first frost." She straightened her aching back and leaned on the handle of her shovel. "The house Liam built," she said, gesturing toward the clapboard structure with her head. "It can't stand against the winter here. I almost froze in it last year. This will be warmer. The earth is warm." Silas shook his head slowly, a look of profound disbelief on his face. "The earth is cold, Alara. It's damp. You'll catch your death of pneumonia in that hole before the snow even flies. It's a root cellar, not a house." He saw he was making no headway. He sighed, a man defeated by a woman's folly. "At least let me help you with that rock," he said, and without waiting for an answer, he climbed down into the pit. He was a strong man, and with a long iron pry bar from his wagon and their combined effort, the rock was finally dislodged. He helped her haul it out, his face grim. When it was done, he stood, wiping his hands on his trousers. "You're a stubborn woman, Ilara. Liam was stubborn too. Look where it got him." He left without another word, the pity in his eyes having hardened into a kind of resigned disapproval. His visit was the beginning of the talk. The story of the widow digging her own home into the ground spread through the community like a grass fire. It became a source of grim amusement, of head-shaking gossip over fences and at the general store. They gave her a name, the Mole Woman. The name was whispered at first, then spoken aloud with a casual cruelty. Children would sometimes creep to the edge of her property and peer down into the hole, daring each other to get closer, before running away with shrieks of laughter. The ridicule was a constant low-grade hum in the background of her life, another form of weather to be endured. It hurt, but the physical reality of her work was too demanding to leave much room for wounded pride. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of the hole she was digging, to the ache in her back and the burn in her muscles. Marcus's next visit was not one of pity, but of anger. He had heard the stories in town, and his face was flushed with shame. He strode to the edge of the pit and stared down at her, his hands on his hips. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with indignation. "They're laughing at you, Ilara. They're laughing at our family. You are making a spectacle of yourself, a mockery of Liam's memory. This is madness." She did not stop her work. She continued to methodically slice into the earth with her shovel, lifting and tossing the dirt onto the growing pile. "This is survival, Marcus," she said without looking at him. "It is no more a mockery than freezing to death in a house that can't be heated." He scoffed, a sharp, ugly sound. "You call this a house? It's a ditch. You'll be buried alive in it, either by the dirt or the snow. Sell this cursed place, for God's sake, have some dignity." Dignity, she thought, was a luxury. It was a word used by people who had warm beds and full bellies. Dignity would not keep the frost from her lungs. "I am not selling," she said, her voice flat and final. Her refusal, her calm defiance in the face of his fury, seemed to unhinge him. He saw her not as a grieving widow trying to survive, but as a madwoman willfully destroying the last vestiges of their family's respectability. "This is the last time I offer," he spat. "When you are starving and frozen in this hole you've dug for yourself, do not come to me." He turned on his heel and stormed back to his buggy, leaving her alone in the quiet of the afternoon, the sound of her own rhythmic digging the only reply. The work was a brutal teacher. She learned the language of the soil, the way it changed with depth and moisture. She learned the heft of stone, the precise point of balance for the wheelbarrow, the geometry of leverage. She made mistakes. A section of the wall collapsed after a heavy rain, and she spent a week digging it out and learning how to shore up the sides properly, using heavy timbers she salvaged from the collapsing woodshed. She learned to read the sun, planning the depth and angle of her south-facing excavation to catch the low winter light. This was the most difficult part, a careful carving of a wide, deep trench that would eventually hold the windows. For this she needed glass, and she had no money. She sold the last of her mother's silver lockets in town, enduring the storekeeper's pitying gaze, and bought 6 large panes of thick glass, transporting them home on a bed of straw in a borrowed cart, her heart in her throat with every jolt in the road. As summer bled into autumn, the structure began to take a shape that was, to anyone but her, even more bizarre than the initial pit. It was a long, rectangular hollow in the ground, with earthen walls and a floor that was a full 6 feet below the surface level of the hill. She had used the largest, flattest stones she had unearthed to build a retaining wall for the south-facing opening and a solid foundation for the hearth and chimney at the back. Using Liam's old block and tackle, a tool she had to teach herself to use through painful trial and error, she hauled massive timbers into place for the roof beams. She laid a thick layer of planking over them, then a layer of oiled canvas for waterproofing, and then, finally, she began the arduous task of covering the entire roof with the tons of earth she had excavated. She was burying her house, returning the soil to its place, leaving only the stone-lined southern face and the chimney exposed. To an onlooker, it looked as if the earth had swallowed a small cabin whole. Silas came by again in late October. The air had a sharp, crystalline edge to it, and the sky was the color of steel. He did not speak at first, just stood there for a long time, taking in the sight. Her creation was nearly complete. A sturdy door, taken from the old house, was set into the southern wall. The glass panes were installed, creating a wall of light that faced the sun. A thin plume of smoke rose from the stone chimney that poked out of the grassy mound. It did not look like a house. It looked like a wound in the earth that was beginning to heal over. He finally shook his head. "Well, you've done it," he said. The words held neither praise nor condemnation, only a kind of weary wonder. "I've never seen the like. It's an abomination," he seemed to want to say. But he couldn't. There was a strange solidity to it, a sense of permanence that her flimsy clapboard house had never possessed. "Are you ready for what's coming?" he asked, his eyes on the northern horizon. "The old-timers are saying it'll be a bad one. The geese flew south a month early, and the squirrels' coats are thicker than I've ever seen." "I am as ready as I can be," Ilara replied. He nodded, still looking at her strange, earth-swallowed home. He had come to deliver one last warning, to make one final appeal to reason. But looking at the quiet determination on her face, and the undeniable reality of what she had built with her own two hands, he found he had no words left. He just wished her luck and drove away, feeling a strange premonition, a sense that the world was about to be turned upside down. The blizzard arrived not with a gentle preamble of snow flurries, but as a sudden, violent declaration of war. One afternoon, the sky turned a bruised greenish gray, the temperature plummeted, and the wind began to howl like a hungry wolf. Within an hour, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of white. It was not snow, it was a horizontal torrent of ice crystals, a blinding, scouring force that erased the horizon and reduced visibility to zero. The people of the plains knew blizzards, but this was different. This was a living thing, a monstrous entity of wind and cold that clawed at their homes and sought to devour everything in its path. They would later call it the Great White Hurricane, a storm that would become the benchmark for all winters to come. Inside her earth-hewn shelter, Ilara felt the storm's arrival as a gradual muffling of the world. The light from her south-facing windows dimmed as the snow began to drift and pile up against the glass. The sound of the wind, which she had expected to be a terrifying roar, was a distant, muted drone. It was the sound of a storm happening somewhere else, far above her head. The thick blanket of earth and snow on her roof was an almost perfect sound insulator. She had a small, efficient wood stove, which she had carefully installed in the stone hearth, and it filled the single large room with a steady, even warmth. The air was still. She lit a kerosene lamp, and its golden glow pushed back the gloom, reflecting off the smooth, plastered earthen walls. She made herself a cup of tea and sat in her rocking chair, listening. There was no rattling, no groaning, no whistling of drafts. There was only the deep, profound silence of the earth and the gentle hiss of the fire. For 3 days, the storm raged. In the town and the surrounding farms, it was a time of terror and desperation. The wind, recorded at speeds of over 70 miles per hour, was a physical force that tested every nail and every joint of the houses that stood in its path. It drove the fine, granular snow through the tiniest of cracks, under doors, around window frames, into attics. Families huddled together in a single room, stuffing rags and blankets into the gaps, feeding their fires constantly, only to watch the heat be stolen away by the gale. The cold was a relentless, invasive presence, dropping to 30, then 40 degrees below zero. It was a cold that killed. Water froze in pipes, then split them. Livestock, caught in their barns, froze to death, standing up. People died in their own homes, their fires extinguished by winds that screamed down their chimneys. In Silas's well-built farmhouse, a structure that had been his father's pride, the family was fighting a losing battle. He and his 2 sons worked in shifts, clearing the snow that piled up against the doors and reinforcing the windows that threatened to shatter under the wind's assault. His wife, Mary, kept the fire roaring in the great hearth, but the cold was winning. A fine dusting of snow covered the floorboards on the north side of the house. The water in the bucket by the door was frozen solid. On the second night, a terrible cracking sound echoed through the house as a massive roof beam contracting in the extreme cold split. Silas looked at his wife's frightened face, at his children shivering under a mountain of blankets, and felt a despair he had never known. They had food, they had wood, but they were losing the war against the cold. And then a thought, absurd and desperate, came to him. The mole woman, Ilara. He argued with himself. She was likely dead, buried in her own foolish grave. Her chimney, so low to the ground, would be blocked. She would have suffocated or frozen. It was madness to even think of going out in this. But the image of her standing in her pit, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes burning with certainty, haunted him. It was a fool's errand, but the thought of his own children freezing in his sturdy, sensible house drove him to it. He bundled himself in every layer he owned, tied a rope around his waist, and gave the other end to his eldest son, and plunged into the white chaos. The journey was a nightmare. The 50 yards to Ilara's property took him nearly half an hour. The wind tore at him, trying to rip the breath from his lungs. The snow was so deep he had to flounder through it like a man drowning. He navigated by memory and instinct, feeling for the familiar line of the fence. He found her land and stumbled toward the hill where she had dug her home. At first, he saw nothing. The entire landscape was a series of massive, sculpted snowdrifts. Panic seized him. She was buried. He had been a fool. Then he saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible column of gray rising into the swirling white. Smoke. The chimney was clear. He scrambled toward it, his frozen hands clawing at the snow. He found the southern face of her dwelling, a deep cut in a mountain of snow. The windows were completely covered, but he found the door, or at least where the door should be. He dug frantically with his hands, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He found the handle and pulled. It was not frozen shut. It opened. He fell more than stepped inside, tumbling into a world of calm, quiet warmth. He landed on a soft rug, and the door swung shut behind him, cutting off the raging howl of the storm as if a switch had been thrown. He lay there for a moment stunned, his senses reeling from the sudden, shocking transition. The air was warm, not just tolerable, but genuinely comfortably warm. He pushed himself up and looked around. Ilara was sitting in her rocking chair by the stove, a book in her lap. She looked up at him, her expression not of surprise, but of a kind of calm expectation. "Hello, Silas," she said, her voice even. "You look cold. Would you like some tea?" He could not speak. He could only stare. The room was bathed in the soft light of 2 oil lamps. A small fire crackled merrily in the stove. There were no drafts. The air was perfectly still. He could hear the storm, but it was a distant, irrelevant murmur, a story being told in another world. He looked at the walls, not of wood, but of smooth, whitewashed plaster over the packed earth. He looked at the thick wooden beams of the ceiling and the solid planking above them. He looked at the wall of windows, now covered with a thick, insulating blanket of snow, a barrier the cold could not breach. He finally took off his ice-caked gloves and held his hands out, feeling the radiant warmth from the stove. "How?" he finally managed to whisper. The single word, a surrender of a lifetime of certainty. "How is this possible?" She smiled, a small, tired smile. "The wind can't take what it can't find," she said simply, "and the cold can't steal the warmth from the earth." She got up and poured him a cup of steaming tea. He took it, his hands shaking so badly he nearly spilled it. He drank it down, the warmth spreading through his frozen core. He thought of his own house, the pride of his family, currently being torn apart by the storm. He thought of his wife and children shivering, fighting for their lives. And he looked at this woman, this mad woman, this mole woman, sitting peacefully in her quiet, warm hole in the ground. And he understood. He had been the fool. They had all been the fools. The storm broke on the fourth day. The aftermath was a scene of devastation. The landscape was altered, unrecognizable under the massive drifts. The community slowly emerged, blinking in the bright, cold sunlight to count their losses. And the losses were staggering. Nearly every family had lost livestock. Many homes were severely damaged. Old Man Hemlock, who lived alone on the edge of town, had been found frozen in his chair, his fire long dead. The story of Silas's journey to Ilara's home began to circulate, passed in hushed, incredulous tones. At first, no one believed it. It was impossible. But Silas was not a man given to fancy. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose word was as solid as the ground he farmed. Slowly, they came to see for themselves. They came in small, hesitant groups, their faces a mixture of skepticism and desperate curiosity. They walked across the frozen snow and stared at the mound of earth with a chimney sticking out of it. Ilara would open her door and let them in, into the quiet, stable warmth of her home. They would stand there, their hats in their hands, their eyes wide with disbelief, and feel the truth of it. They would touch the earthen walls, they would hold their hands over the small, efficient stove, they would look at the woman they had mocked, and they would see not a fool, but a prophet. The mockery died, replaced by a profound, grudging respect that slowly blossomed into awe. The name Mole Woman was never spoken again. Instead, they began to speak of Ilara's method. Marcus came, not with anger, but with a quiet, humbled shame. He stood in the doorway of her home and could not bring himself to step inside. He just looked at her, at the impossible shelter she had built, and mumbled an apology before turning and leaving, his straight lines and sharp corners softened and bent by the undeniable truth of her success. That spring Silas came to her not with advice, but with a request. He asked if she would teach him. He wanted to build a storm shelter for his family, a small one, based on her design. She agreed. Others followed. The woman who had been an outcast became a teacher, a font of a new, old kind of wisdom. She never sought recognition, but it found her. She had not set out to prove anyone wrong. She had only set out to survive. But in doing so, she had shown them all a different way to live. Decades passed. The Great White Hurricane became a legend, a story told to frighten children and chasten the proud. And the landscape of the plains began to change. Dotted among the traditional vulnerable farmhouses were new structures, low-slung and solid, their roofs covered in prairie grass, their faces turned to the southern sun. They were called earth-hews or prairie shelters, and they were the architectural legacy of a lone woman who had listened to the earth when everyone else was shouting at the sky. Ilara lived out her days in her quiet, warm home, a figure of respect and quiet authority. She never remarried, finding a deep and abiding companionship in the land that had once been her adversary. She had not conquered it. She had come to an understanding with it. There is a wisdom in the world that does not announce itself with thunder, but whispers in the stillness of a cellar, in the silent patience of the soil. Society often builds its walls high, believing that strength is measured in how proudly we can stand against the storm. But true resilience is sometimes found not in defiance, but in humility. It is found in the courage to look foolish, to dig down when others build up, to seek shelter not in the structures of man, but in the constants of the earth. Ilara's story is a testament to this quiet truth, that the most profound innovations are often not inventions at all, but rediscoveries of what the world has been trying to tell us all along. The greatest shelter from the howling winds of life is not a fortress, but an understanding. It is the wisdom to know when to fight and when to simply come in from the cold.